Now, I have the honor of giving the floor to Professor Marc Steiner, an expert, a legal expert in public procurement. Marc, thank you very much for being with us. You have the floor.
For inviting me, Michel. I think I owe this somehow to Brian Iselin, but I'm not really sure about. However, welcome everyone to that legal topic. It's about legal approaches to reducing the demand behind human trafficking, but with a special focus on public procurement. My, let's say, hypothesis is that public procurement can be seen as a blueprint for something like a conscious capitalism. This sounds at first glance perhaps a little bit naive, but I will give you the proof. Brian relies on proof, and so do I, that this is definitely, let's say, that we can observe a paradigm change in public procurement regulation, let's say, during the last 10 years. We have seen so spectacular changes that this can be seen as like a nucleus for a new form of decent capitalism. That might be a little bit exaggerated at first glance, but you will hopefully be convinced that there lies a great opportunity after having heard what I have to say during the next quarter of an hour. Michel told me that perhaps we should give a general perspective on how to make the world a better place. I mean, for a Swiss, it's obvious that it's very important to make transparent and to ask big investors how money is invested. That's, for a Swiss perspective, obvious because we have a very important financial marketplace. So that would be a first lever, let's say, for a real change in economy. Second lever, in order to bring a real change to economy, is how to design development aid, how to design trade politics, trade contracts, trade treaties, trade regulation, including dispute settlement, WTO, you name it. That's the second thing. And the third and the fourth of these giant levers are supply chain related. So the one is supply chains of big enterprises. If we don't invest money, we buy stuff, and the sum of investments and buying is the economy. So supply chain of private firms and enterprises are the third lever, and the fourth is, that may be astonishing at first glance, but it's obvious considering the money being in it, public procurement. So if you want to change the world and you don't address public procurement, then I think you are not serious with what you're claiming. So the point is that to see how it came to the paradigm shift I'm trying to advocate, I will focus in the next minutes a little bit on legal history. I will tell you that we have been coming out of a neoliberal concept, and now we are replacing this neoliberal concept by a new vision of public supply chain management. This is true for the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. This is true for the European Union Public Procurement Directives 2014. They are very progressive, very focused on sustainability, but there is not so much discussion about this because this all is considered to be a technocrat's matter, and so the broad public is not interested what happens in public procurement. But this is a big, huge mistake. And the same is true also for Switzerland, because the new Swiss regime, the new law entered into force on federal level 1st of January 2021, so it's really new. makes the same as the European Union regulation, namely saying, hey guys, we want a new philosophy of the whole thing based on competition based on quality, not competition based on price. We want to see innovation and we want to see sustainability. So the earlier neoliberal concept was market access, competition, money, and nothing else. And now we have the new keywords, competition based on quality, innovation, and sustainability. Sounds quite different, isn't it? But we go deeper into this. In order to understand what people can have as a possible mindset when discussing public procurement, I compare this with archaeological layers. When I was a young student at high school, I wanted to become an archaeologist, not a lawyer, not at all. And then the archaeologist in charge told me, before you start digging, Mark, you have to paint the layers. You have to paint what you see, describe them, give them a number, in order afterwards have an order to explain people where you found which object in order to put it in a correct way afterwards in a museum, for instance. And that's the fascination of describing or painting archaeological layers. And what we are doing now is painting mindset layers on public procurement. What we were first in Switzerland were protectionists. We wanted to have a closed market, giving preference to local bidders, encouraging favoritism, protectionism, collusion of bidders was very frequent in Switzerland during the 80s of the last century. So the first layer can be described as protectionism, as anti-market access strategy. So it's clearly designed not to go for open markets. That's protectionism. In the 90s, the neoliberalism took over and wanted to destroy the layer one philosophy, abolish protectionism in favor of market access, competition, and money. And first Switzerland thought, we will do this all becoming a member of the European Economic Area, so the neoliberal concept would be bought automatically, be adhering the European Economic Area. But this strategy failed. The Swiss people didn't want to be part of the European Economic Area. So Switzerland built its own neoliberal regulation of the 90s, including an internal market law for Switzerland to make more market access from canton to canton. Let's imagine how ridiculous this is from an international perspective. But anyhow, internal market law, Cartel Act on competition issues, then Government Procurement Agreement, WTO, 1994, Public Procurement Regulation, and all this together gave us a layer 2 understanding, neoliberal, market access, competition, money, competition based on price, and nothing else, especially not sustainability. That's the layer 2 concept, clearly neoliberal, and that's where we are coming out from. And a high-rank WTO official told me once when we had dinner in Nottingham at the most famous conference in public procurement hosted by Professor Sue Arrowsmith, Mark, don't you agree that's a very strange world we are coming out of? And thereby he described this layer 2 thinking. And this shows you already that the WTO is meanwhile elsewhere and not anymore in the layer 2 concept. The new concept we are all in now, in Europe especially, is competition based on quality, sustainability, and innovation. This is encouraged by the WTO Government Procurement Agreement 2012, by the European Union Public Procurement Directives 2014, and of course also the new Swiss regulation on public procurement. So this is layer 3, and this shows you that there's a real paradigm shift. There are other keywords, a new understanding, a new vision, and a new mindset finally. So what does this mean? First, the WTO has moved, adopting the new Government Procurement Agreement 2012, saying, hey guys, earlier WTO instruments on procurement were seen as market access tools. That's still the truth, but not the only idea of the regulation. There are other ideas, such as fighting corruption, which normally is considered not to be a WTO topic. And what's even more important, it's also on governance and promoting development, of course, including sustainability issues. So the GPA 2012 Government Procurement Agreement makes a paradigm change from layer 2 to layer 3, saying, hey guys, the WTO is now open to a new mindset which focuses on quality, innovation, and sustainability. So this is the first great step forward. And the logical consequence of it is that they organized a symposium on sustainable procurement. This would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. Now it's absolutely a current issue to discuss sustainability issues in public procurement in a WTO context. It's really no problem. It's a huge change of mindset and understanding. The problem is no one speaks about it because it's such a special topic. It's a technocrat's business. It's complicated and it's not suited to discuss with a broad public. I don't agree, by the way. You can do this if you want. But that's the problem, that there's so much money in this. You can't possibly treat this topic as a technocrat's affair. If not, you are losing a wonderful tool to change the world. And no one would like to do that. Or am I mistaken? So, okay, WTO did a step forward, and the European Union, of course, was enthusiastic about this and said, okay, guys, if they go from layer 2 to layer 3, saying, hey, guys, the public procurement is a tool to achieve sustainability goals, then we will say the same. And that was the real change in Brussels. Thanks to the European Parliament, by the way. Some other institutions were not quite fond of that, but the European Parliament has won the battle. Especially the Committee on Internal Market was very progressive, and they did it at the end, saying, hey guys, now the world is really different thanks to this new regulation. So WTO step forward, European Union step forward, including a mandatory exclusion ground in case of trafficking in human beings. And that's, yes, not by coincidence, the topic of today. And what's also included are ILO co-labor standards, also as exclusion grounds. So it's clear that's not only a market access thing, but it's also about coherence with other policy goals than just competition, like sustainability. It's a more coherent vision of the whole legal system. And that's the idea of layer 3, more quality, more sustainability, more policy coherence, and more innovation. From a legal term, this is a more holistic view, and that's the only way of thinking for the future. I'm personally very convinced about that. Okay, we have seen now WTO made a step forward, European Union made a step forward. Now let's wait and see what happened in Switzerland. Switzerland has the habit of advocating at the highest level when it comes to the Department of Foreign Affairs how important the topic of human trafficking is. But if I ask those diplomats whether they involve the Ministry of Finance, where public procurement is done, or the Ministry of Economy, which hates social minimum standards basically because they are layer 2 people defending market access, competition, money, and nothing else, those people of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tell me, no, we didn't have any contact with those departments or ministries. So I say, okay, so much about the seriousness of you having the thing high on the agenda. But that's not a topic. That could be another, let's say, discussion of 20 minutes, but I'll spare you that because it leads me a bit outside my focus explaining legal issues. So the point is that the new regulation on public procurement says in its Article 2 that sustainability is aim and purpose of the law. This is a spectacular change. No one would have expected that 10 years ago. It's the parliament making this thing possibly against the resistance of big business and the Association of the Economy in Switzerland called Economie Suisse. They hated, of course, this idea of having sustainability as aim and purpose, but the parliament with a majority defended sustainability as aim and purpose of the law. So that's really different. And the interesting thing is there's one tool guaranteeing social minimum standards. That's what you're interested in. ILO, core labor standard, forced labor, child labor, human trafficking. If that's not complied with, the bidder is excluded. That's the interesting stuff. And this implies also the right of a public procuring entity to go for audits abroad. It's explicitly mentioned in the law that the public authorities, when procuring, are allowed to go for audits wherever their supply chain is. And that's a really cool stuff because there are some lawyers saying, hey, if you do audits abroad, this is a forbidden extraterritorial behavior. But I'm telling them, hey guys, when I buy something, I'm not regulating. And that's not extraterritorial because I behave like a merchant and every merchant can ask for audits. So it's not a forbidden extraterritorial behavior if I, as a public entity, ask for an audit. And that's great. That's now the absolutely majority view on the topic, which is an obvious paradigm change. The next thing is that it's not only about minimum standards, but also on competition based on quality. The price is less important than according to the earlier regulation. The new regulation says the more advantageous tender wins the award, which means that's a quality matter and not a question of price. And that's a really cool move because this gives a new understanding on what the whole thing is about. Interestingly enough, as well as in Europe, as well as in Switzerland, you can give extra points for fair trade. So let's say if you buy fair trade coffee, then you do more than just prevent slavery and child labor. You give extra point for extra goodies, for an extra social friendly supply chain. And this you can reward within the award criteria. So you can put sustainability as an award criterion and give extra points if you have, for instance, fair trade coffee offered. And that's really cool because this makes another system change, because according to the old regulation in Switzerland and public procurement, this was forbidden because lack of legal basis, and now it's explicitly allowed, and now you can give extra points for fair trade issues and outweigh a higher price, and that's really cool. So the minimum standards combined with extra point for fair trade makes the world change. That's the idea of the new public procurement regulation. Conclusion. There can be clearly found a paradigm change when it comes to the modern way of regulating public procurement, be it in the WTO, be it in the European Union, be it in Switzerland since the 1st January of 2021. This means that the neoliberal mindset layer 2, as described within this archaeological layers, let's say, picture in a broad term, the mindset layer 2 consisting of market access, competition based on price, money and nothing else, is recently overlaid by a mindset layer 3, competition based on quality, sustainability and innovation. And the interesting thing is that if you ask from a private enterprise to buy sustainably, this could be a problem. But if you ask from a public entity, that's clear that he has to buy decently, because every constitution in Europe tells public entities to foster sustainable development, which you can only do if you buy sustainably. So it's a matter of policy coherence to commit yourself as a public entity on a layer 3 concept, competition based on quality, sustainability, innovation. This can make out of public procurement a blueprint for a conscious capitalism, especially concerning supply chain, because if the world gets aware that public buying can do this, that public supply chains can be cleaner, then they will ask the same also from private supply chains. And that's a benchmarking effect. And if we achieve this, then the world really looks different. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Judge Steiner. Thank you so much, Marc, for this comprehensive and very lively and convincing intervention. Thanks also for your proposals for making the world a better place in investing, in designing development aid, in regulating public procurement at a Swiss, European, and international level. Actually, we could now welcome questions in the Q&A section of this webinar. Allow me to read one. It's coming from Canada, and that's a survivor who say, can you email provide the main website link with all the upcoming human trafficking webinars your organization provides? I can tell you, yes, I will. Your speakers are very informative and progressive. If you would like to network with them directly to advertise your webinars, please contact them and give an email address, nthtnetworkcanada@gmail.com. Then definitely, as you've seen on our chat and Q&A, actually you have the adlaudatosi website. You have also christusliberat.org website, and all of those could be definitely quite interesting. And actually, as we have no other question, or possibly some other question could come, I would be happy to give the floor again to Brian Islin and Judge Marc Steiner for additional reflections on this very important issue. Brian, I'm feeling that you are ready to shoot, no?
Always ready to shoot, Michelle.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to comment on was so with my project at Slave Free Trade, one of the things we're trying to do is introduce what I call a third track in communications between businesses and supply chains. So what we've had up until now from the 60s is supply chains are made up of disaggregated supply chain actors, companies buying and selling from each other. Now there are two tracks to that dialogue. One track is price, the other track is quality. So this is a different quality that I'm talking about than to what Marc was talking about in public procurement law. The quality in this case is about a certain number of kilos of coffee beans at a certain grade and refined to a certain degree. So these quality characteristics are all about the product. So what we've seen since the 60s and arguably the 70s actually, with this the manifestation, the spreading of global supply chains, is that these actors only talk to each other about these two characteristics. And as soon as the conversation changes to add anything else to the conversation, it shuts down. So if you ask any small business, for example, my cousin was setting up a drop shipping company at one point, a fashion business. And so she needed to connect with suppliers who could provide quickly. And her experience with companies in the supply chain for handbags and belts and dresses and so on was exactly the same as everybody else's experience, which is that they get to their first level supplier, they ask about characteristics of quality and price, and they understand that. And then as soon as they ask any questions about the ethicality or sustainability of these products, they get shut down. They hit a blank wall. The suppliers aren't providing it. So one of the really interesting things with what we're trying to do with Slave Free Trade is we connect each workplace in a supply chain by virtue of their human rights performance. So let's talk about a three-tier supply chain. A chocolatier goes to their supplier is a cocoa processor, their supplier is a plantation, so a classic three-tier supply chain. And in that supply chain, each of the workplaces in that chain gets a human rights performance score. And those scores are connected, those workplaces are connected, so that the chain score means the chocolate bar at the retail end can't go on the shelf unless each of the human rights workplace is human rights compliant. Now, our hypothesis in putting all of this together was that we would be introducing this third track, that suddenly that we felt that these companies would actually start then to talk about human rights if we connected them this way, because they become dependent on each other's human rights performance. In our pilot, the cocoa supply chain that I mentioned, it worked out exactly like that. These disaggregated supply chain actors started talking about price, continued talking about price and quality, and added human rights to their conversation. It became the third track. And in some ways, it actually became compelling for them, because the staff in the first workplace at the top of the supply chain, suddenly actually they became interested, not just on a purchasing level, they became interested in the workplace conditions in the plantation at tier 3, where they had no visibility whatsoever before. So it's really exciting to see these disaggregated supply chain actors turning into collaborative networked organizations because of the addition of human rights communication and understanding. So I wanted to say that.
Can I add to this a sentence?
Of course.
Now, this is the really interesting point where we get to the breakthrough in Switzerland, because at the beginning it was the same thing. Outside of traditional quality issues, no communication at all. And then we had army combat boots procurement from the defense ministry. And some journalists found out where they were produced and under which conditions. And they were a disaster. And so the journalist went back in Switzerland and told the Ministry of Defense, do you really want to be responsible for those conditions? And then the Ministry of Defense told them, we are not responsible, ask the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance told them, we are not responsible, ask the Ministry of Defense. And so the journalist cut those two statements together, and the broad public of Swiss TV had a great laugh. Everyone found this so amusing that the kind of communication of official, this was really, let's say, devastating in the proper sense of the term. And so since then, they have got the message that being more ambitious when going for social standards in public procurement is a reputational risk management issue. And so this is the way to make them understand that quality means today more than it meant 50 years ago, perhaps. But sorry for intervening. It's your floor, Brian.
No, you're supposed to be intervening. It's a discussion, Mark, and I welcome it. I would also ask for your comment on one of the other points, which was that you were talking in the Swiss laws about, you used the word sustainability quite a lot. Now, one of the interesting things that I've found with slave free trade is that whenever we talk sustainability with businesses or consumers, most of them don't include in sustainability ethicality. They don't include human rights. So when they talk sustainability, it's all green, which is why we have the term greenwashing, whether it refers to human rights or the environment. So the definition of sustainability, one of the things on my agenda is to broaden the definition. Sustainability has got to include the human. And if you think about it from an ESG perspective, environment, social governance, the S is the poor cousin. It's the one never talked about at the table. It's like the cousin nobody wants, the uncle, nobody wants to invite to the wedding. So social sustainability is the one that never gets talked about. So I would love to get your thoughts about what we might do to broaden the definition of, or the understanding of sustainability, not just in public perspective, but even within companies.
Oh, yes, this is a really huge topic. I can give you an answer perhaps based on the European Union directives. So there were two reforms in Europe. 2004 was a reform more or less limited on green public procurement because social aspects were very disputed. And 2014, when the next reform came, it was crystal clear that sustainability means economics, environment, and social aspects in a European public procurement understanding. And since then, this is undisputed also inside the WTO and Switzerland, because the European model made it really clear that this cannot be seen only green sustainability concept is absolutely, it's deprived of its meaning. It makes no sense. And what is interesting that we can now see what happens in America. When you look after COVID-19, Corona, you see that Joe Biden announces a Build Back Better program. This is a kind of a comparable concept as a Green New Deal would be in Europe. And the problem is that the Americans, they are now where the Europeans have been 2004, seeing sustainability only as a green thing without implying ethical issues and social minimum standards. So we have to explain the US what happened in Europe in order to make them understand that they are going exactly the same way just 10 years later.
No, thank you very much, Mark. Actually, there are two things. First, I think we need to see that integral ecology in the meaning of the Laudato Si encyclical is very much in this direction, including the human in the environment. Second, I must say we have now also a question, and this question is I don't know. You could possibly both try to answer it, but I would possibly ask first, Brian. Is there any company that has a good track record so that it can be held up to others as a good example? when we began the fair trade movement, one of the ways we go to the products into mainstream supermarkets was to give examples of those who embraced fair trade. Now, notice fewer fair trade products in the supermarket. Can we build on a fair trade model? I don't know. Could you possibly both try to answer this question?
Sure. Can I go first, Marc? Can I go first, Marc? Yes. Okay. Good. So build on fair trade model. I do want to answer the question directly, but I'll also try and hedge and get around it a bit. But can we build on the fair trade model? I think we have to recognize that fair trade has pretty much peaked. And one of the reasons for that, there are lots of reasons, but one of the reasons for that is that equal profit doesn't resonate emotionally with people anymore. It was a big thing in the 70s, big thing in the 80s. It's no longer there. People don't resonate with equal profit. So you get people going into a supermarket looking at two chocolates. One is a fair trade chocolate. They see there's a $1.70 difference because of the premium on fair trade products. 61% of which goes to the retailer, by the way. So it's interesting that people just don't feel strongly about fair trade anymore. And many people will not pay the $1.70 and they'll put it back. Supermarkets know that, which is why they're now carrying less fair trade products. And in some supermarket cases, they've dropped fair trade products completely because consumers just won't pay the premium anymore. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that fair trade is not a human rights standard. Fair trade has some characteristics around child labor, for example, as part of their framework, but they're not a human rights standard. They don't address a comprehensive range of human rights in workplaces. The other thing to consider is that they're a function of the old and, let's say, very strongly outmoded model of certification and audit. So that means that they put a label. Certification and audit is where you put a label on something on the basis of an infrequent audit where people actually go out to a workplace and have a look in a very small percentage of supply chains and workplaces, and not even every year, every 3 years, for example. So certification and audit has been shown to be wanting in a failed model. The one-dimensional label that goes on a product in the shelves in supermarkets for all the labels, not just fair trade, but B Corp, Fair Wear, Better Cotton Initiative, they've all been shown to be really, really wanting when it comes to the proof of the pudding. So fair trade, we can learn from what fair trade did by mobilizing consumers with a label on products. They were one of the first social labels since abolition. And that's a very important thing that they did. They showed that you can move markets by moving consumers, which is a really important precedent. But unfortunately, when it comes to human rights, I just don't find them very relevant for people anymore. I speak to people about it all the time, every day, and most people just think it's plateaued. We can definitely learn from them. We can definitely canvass and corral demand at the consumer level, and that consumer demand. Let me just tell a quick story. Sorry, Marc, I'm taking the floor, but just want to tell a quick story. So 20 years ago, one of my first cases was a forced labor case, which was also a child labor and human trafficking case, as it turned out. 12-year-old boy shot in the head, dumped overboard from a prawn boat. Now, one of the very interesting things was that he was a 12-year-old child. He was child labor, he was human trafficking, and he was forced labor. And none of those definitions that we hold so dear to us at the national and international level meant a damn thing to him. None of them reflected what his needs were. None of them. So that was one of the first lessons I learned. But one of the other lessons was that the prawns that came from those boats ended up in supermarket freezers right across Europe. And I just put myself in that position 20 years ago, thinking at that time about a Parisian shopper standing in front of a supermarket freezer, Carrefour in Paris, for example, looking at the frozen prawns. They had absolutely no way of knowing what's going on behind those prawns. However, if we can put on the prawns that have been caught the right way, with human rights standards applied and provable in real time, we can make that single shopper change their buying decision in 0.75 of a second. That buying preference multiplied millions of times sends a tsunami down the value chain. And that sends the message that preferential buying will be directed towards those companies that can prove human rights compliance in their workplaces. And then everybody down the value chain has to respond, including retailers. The consumers send a loud message to retailers when they take those actions. This is what we can learn. And this is what slave-free trade is all about.
Marc, you have something to add, certainly? Yeah.
Yes, the problem is that also when it comes to social minimum standards, we cannot avoid labels and certificates. For instance, what's very common in supply chain context is the label SA8000 to make sure that some social minimum standards are kept. So the idea of being able to do business in supply chain without labels and certificate would perhaps little bit naive. What is true is that we need to do more than this. And that's where Brian and I think easily agree. So this just to give you an additional information, because without labels and certificates, supply chain management will already, because of a transaction costs logics in an economic understanding, never work.
Okay. Brian, an additional comment? Or?
No, I agree with Marc.
Okay, that's good. That's good. But we know, and actually, I would like to thank you for bringing Marc to this webinar, because thanks to you, we could, we are both Swiss and both based in Switzerland, but we needed you, an Australian friend, to bring us together. So,
well, I'm also made in Switzerland, right? I mean, my family is 600 years in Glarus canton. So.
No, it did. No, that's very good. Actually, I had no more questions, just people asking me why we did not deal with sexual exploitation. I can say that it was on purpose, because we could actually do that. We did that in past.
We have done that. Yeah.
We have done that. We will do most probably in the future. But please visit adlaudatosi.org and see the past webinars, and you'll see that there were quite interesting interventions, both on the trauma, both on the treatment, both on the criminal prosecution. And I see, Brian, that you want to add something. Please do.
I just see a question there about, is the UN human rights compliant? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Guaranteed, they are covered in slavery.
Okay, I will just say that.
And I hope someone from the UN will respond.
Yeah. No. I would just like to say that indeed you had very good special rapporteurs, when now you have Professor Obokata from Japan and based and teaching in the UK. You have also other special rapporteurs like Professor Moulali. She's a professor in Ireland. We had Judge Maria Grazia Gian Marinaro from Italy. I must say all those people, and I can also name a few others, including a judge from South Africa. I must say all those were indeed publishing quite interesting things. But I agree with you, Brian, that next to those interesting reports, I don't know what the end effect was, and
they would all readily admit that the UN is just covered in slavery. They buy and sell. Their procurement procedures are no different to any other public procurement institution in the system. But one of the things I wanted to say was that public procurement I think we get this sense, I think people get a sense that public procurement is this big institutional question, right? How do you move public procurement? But in fact, one of the things is to look below the surface of that to the people in the organization. I spoke at the National Procurement Institute conference in the US 2 years ago. Now, this is the national body for municipalities and counties across the United States, so thousands of members. When you sit down and talk to each of the category managers, purchasing managers, and so on at each of these institutions, one of the things that hits you immediately is that there's not a single one of them that wants to be buying slavery. Not one. So those public procurement institutions are not a response to the values of the individuals behind the desks. If those individuals have a choice, it's just like the Parisian shopper with the prawns in front of them. It would take them minutes, less than minutes, to decide on a slavery-free procurement compared to the other tenders that are not. The human behind them is so important. What are their drivers?